I felt the weight of it before I even turned my head. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a physical pressure, heavy and distinct against the sterile hum of the gallery. The room was filled with the usual suspects, collectors with too much money and critics with too little joy, but this feeling cut through the noise like a structural failure. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, specific electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I swirled my wine, bored out of my mind a moment ago, now suddenly, dangerously alert. I didn't look away. I let the tension build, holding my breath, then turned to find the source. I'm an architect. I spend my life understanding how things stand up, how stress distributes across a beam, how light changes a room. When I walk into a place like this, a cavernous, white-walled gallery in Chelsea, I don't just see the art, I see the structure. I see the desperate attempt to manufacture importance through emptiness. The atmosphere here was brittle. You could practically hear the social climbing, the performative laughter echoing off the polished concrete floors. It was all facade. Everyone was posing, angling their bodies to be seen by the right photographer or the right dealer. It was a chaotic blueprint of insecurity. Then I saw her. She was standing near a chaotic abstract piece, something violent with reds and blacks. But she wasn't performing. That was the first thing I noticed. In a room full of flighty socialites fluttering their hands and laughing too loudly, she was absolutely still, grounded. She stood with her weight evenly distributed, her back straight, not stiff, but ready. Like a suspension bridge absorbing the wind. She wasn't looking at the art to be seen looking at it. She was dissecting it. I watched her for a long time. My spot in the corner was safe, a vantage point I'd calculated the moment I arrived. From here, I could see the exits, the bar, and the flow of the crowd without being swept away by it. But watching her felt like finding a flaw in the blueprint, a beautiful, intentional error that demanded attention. She wore a suit, sharp tailoring that hugged her frame with a kind of severe elegance, and she moved with a precision that made everyone else look sloppy. When a waiter offered her champagne, she declined with a subtle shake of her head, barely breaking her focus. She wasn't here to play the game. I took a sip of my own drink, the taste sharp on my tongue. Why was she here? She didn't fit the demographic of the idle, rich, or the desperate artist. There was a gravity to her. I found myself cataloging the details, the curve of her neck as she tilted her head, the way her hands remained clasped behind her back, the unflinching line of her jaw. It was rare to see someone so comfortable in their own silence. It made me want to break it. I had a choice. I could stay here, in the architectural safety of my corner, observing the structural integrity of the evening until it collapsed into drunken networking. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But safety has never built anything memorable. The pull was undeniable, a magnetic force that ignored the logic of the floor plan. I felt a vulnerability bloom in my chest, raw and unexpected. To approach her was to step out of the shadows, to admit that I was looking, that I was interested. It was a risk. In my line of work, one wrong calculation brings the whole ceiling down. But looking at her, standing there like a statue that had decided to breathe, I realized I didn't care about the ceiling. I set my glass on a passing tray. The movement was final. I treated the gallery floor like a strategy map. I plotted the trajectory, past the sculpture of the twisted metal, around the cluster of donors in velvet, directly into her orbit. I needed to see if the structure held up close. I needed to know if that stillness was peace or just a different kind of tension. I straightened my jacket, checked my own reflection in the glass of a framed print, composed, professional, terrified, and began to walk. The distance between us was only 30 feet, but it felt like crossing a canyon. Every step was a commitment. I wasn't just walking across a room, I was walking into a collision. I hear the world before I see it. It is an occupational hazard. I play the cello, an instrument that demands you feel the vibration against your sternum, that you understand the physical weight of a pause before the bow moves. This room, however, was not silent. It was a cacophony of hollow sounds, a discordant symphony that grated against my nerves. The clinking of cheap glass against heavy rings, the shrill pitch of forced laughter, the low electric hum of air conditioning trying to scrub the humanity out of the air. It was out of tune. The whole evening felt like a piece played by an orchestra that hadn't rehearsed, jarring, rhythmically unstable, and deeply exhausting. I stood in front of a painting that looked like a scream trapped in oil, trying to find a single note of truth in the brushstrokes, but all I could hear was the static of the crowd behind me. Then, the frequency changed. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was a shift in pressure, a sudden drop in the ambient noise. I've performed on stages with thousands of eyes on me, but this was singular. A laser focus burning into the space between my shoulder blades. It felt heavy, deliberate, and startlingly intimate. I felt the heat of it rise up the back of my neck. I knew with absolute certainty that if I turned around, I wouldn't be meeting a casual glance. I would be meeting a challenge. I didn't turn immediately. I let the sensation settle, testing the tension of it like a string tuned too tight. Was it a threat? A recognition? The air thickened, charged with an intimacy that felt dangerous among the cold white walls. I took a breath, centered myself like I do before the conductor raises the baton, and turned. She was across the room, standing in the shadows of a structural pillar, anchored in a way that made the rest of the crowd look like they were drifting. And she was staring. Not looking. Staring. She wore a suit that looked like it had been cut from the night sky. Dark, sharp, and tailored to within an inch of its life. Her hair was pulled back, exposing a face that was severe and beautiful in equal measure. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to be polite. She was watching me with an intensity that felt like she was reading the sheet music of my thoughts. My heart did a traitorous double beat. In my world, precision is everything. You hit the note or you don't. There is no middle ground. Her gaze felt like that. Precise. But what was the intent? I scanned her posture. She held herself like someone who built things, or perhaps someone who tore them down. There was an arrogance there, but also a curiosity that softened the edges. Was she another artist? Critical of my presence? A collector wondering if I was worth the investment? Or was it the other thing? The silent question that passes between women in rooms like this. The recognition of a shared frequency. The "are you" and the "I am." I held her eyes. I didn't blink. To look away would be to concede, to admit that her attention flustered me. And it did fluster me. It made my fingers itch to play something low and heavy, something that would match the sudden drop in my stomach. She took a step, then another. She was coming over. The realization hit me with a mix of panic and thrill. I needed a shield. I turned back to the painting, feigning deep interest in a splash of angry red paint. I could hear her heels clicking on the concrete, a rhythmic, steady approach. Click, click, click. It was a tempo I instinctively understood. I didn't move. I just waited for the music to start. The final few steps felt like walking across a tightrope. The closer I got, the more the ambient noise of the gallery fell away, replaced by a heightened awareness of my own heartbeat and the rhythmic click of my heels on the concrete. I didn't rush. Rushing implies desperation, and I wasn't desperate. I was intrigued. There is a difference. I stopped exactly 2 feet to her left. It was a calculated distance, close enough to be an intrusion, far enough to claim I was just looking at the art. I didn't look at her immediately. That would have been too easy, too eager. Instead, I turned my body toward the painting, mimicking her stance. Up close, the canvas was even more chaotic, a violent collision of crimson and charcoal that looked less like art and more like a crime scene. But the painting was irrelevant. It was just the alibi. The real subject was the woman standing in my peripheral vision. The first thing that hit me was the scent. In a room suffocating with cloying florals and powdery, old-money perfumes, she smelled like a storm. It was distinct. Ozone, rain on hot asphalt, and a bass note of something warm and resinous like amber or sandalwood. It was clean, sharp, and maddeningly attractive. It made the air between us feel dense, heavier than it had been a moment ago. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a physical warmth that mocked the sterile air conditioning of the gallery. She didn't move away. She didn't even shift her weight. She let me stand there, occupying her space, testing the boundaries of her solitude. I let the silence stretch. Silence is a structural element. If you use it right, it bears more weight than words. I waited until the tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut between us before I spoke. I kept my voice low, pitched just for her, ignoring the crowd swirling behind us. "It's aggressive," I said, my tone flat, bordering on bored. I gestured vaguely at the canvas with my wine glass. "It's screaming for attention, but there's no structural integrity to support the noise. It's just loud." It was a test. If she was one of the socialites, she would have nodded politely, agreed with the vague criticism, and fluttered away. If she was a pretender, she would have used buzzwords she didn't understand. I watched her profile, waiting for the flinch. There was none. She didn't look at me. She didn't even blink. "It's not screaming," she said. Her voice was lower than I expected, rich and textured, with a resonance that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't a voice that asked for permission. It's vibrating. There's a difference between noise and resonance. One is accidental. She finally turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying precision. "This is deliberate." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely unamused by my attempt at dismissal. She wasn't playing defense. She was counterattacking. A thrill shot through me, sharp and electric. She had called my bluff. "Deliberate doesn't mean successful," I countered, holding her gaze. I refused to back down. "You can deliberately build a house on a fault line. It doesn't mean it won't collapse when the pressure gets too high." "Maybe the collapse is the point," she said softly. She turned her body fully toward me now, abandoning the pretense of the painting entirely. The movement was slow, fluid, and deliberate. We were standing close enough that I could see the faint dusting of gold in her irises, the slight flare of her nostrils as she breathed. Some things are beautiful because they can't hold the weight, because the tension is the only thing keeping them upright. The subtext was so loud, it drowned out the gallery. We weren't talking about paint and canvas anymore. We were talking about the 2 feet of empty space between us. We were talking about the way my hand tightened around the stem of my glass, about the way her gaze dropped to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. She was challenging me to acknowledge it. She was daring me to admit that the structural failure I was criticizing was actually the feeling of my own composure cracking. "Tension is exhausting," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Eventually, something has to give." "Only if you're afraid of the break," she replied. A corner of her mouth quirked up. Not a smile, but a smirk of recognition. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I was an architect of my own defenses, and she was tapping on the glass, waiting to see if it would shatter. This wasn't a polite introduction. It was a negotiation of terms. And for the first time all night, I didn't want to leave the room. I wanted to see how much pressure the structure could take. The word tension hung between us, heavy and vibrating, but I wasn't ready to let the structure collapse just yet. I needed to know if this was just intellectual sparring, a bored professional looking for a mental match, or if the electricity I felt was conducting on a specific shared current. "You aren't here for the art either," I said, stepping away from the painting. "You look at the canvas like it's a structural problem you need to solve." She chuckled, a low, rich sound that I felt in my knees. "I'm an architect," she admitted, turning slightly so her shoulder brushed the air inches from mine. "Occupational hazard. I see load-bearing walls and stress fractures. I can't turn it off. And you? You said the painting was deliberate. That's a musician's word." "Cellist," I replied. "I deal in time and resonance. I can hear when something is out of tune." "And is this room out of tune?" she asked, her voice dropping, inviting me into a conspiracy. "Completely," I said, leaning in. The proximity was dizzying. I could smell the rain and sandalwood on her skin, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the gallery's stale air. It's all sharp keys and missed beats. Look at them. I gestured subtly to a group of donors near the bar, laughing too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. They're performing. It's bad theater. It's exhausting, she agreed, her eyes softening. The desperate need to be relevant. We shared a look of pure, unadulterated cynicism. It was a bond, instantaneous and strong, the shared exhaustion of two women who worked twice as hard to be in the room, only to find the room wasn't worth the effort. It felt safe enough to drop the flag, to light the flare and see if she signaled back. I used to date a curator, I said, keeping my voice casual, watching her eyes with the intensity of a hawk. She dragged me to openings like this 3 times a week. I think I developed an allergy to white wine and pretension. It was the moment of truth. The pronoun was the stone thrown into the water. She. I waited for the ripple. I waited for the polite freeze, the subtle shift in body language, the awkward, "Oh, my husband hates these things too," that would signal a friendly but straight ally. I waited for the door to close. It didn't. Alara didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her expression didn't shift into polite neutrality. Instead, her gaze deepened, anchoring onto mine with a new weight. The ambiguity evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. "She sounds like she had terrible taste in dates," Alara said, the corner of her mouth lifting higher. If she was watching the art instead of you." The air left my lungs. It wasn't just acceptance. It was a return volley. She hadn't just caught the flag. She had picked it up and wrapped it around us. The game had changed instantly. The question was no longer if there was a spark. The question was how long we could stand here, burning in the middle of the gallery, before someone noticed the smoke. "She was focused on her career," I managed to say, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Her loss," Alara murmured. She shifted, turning her body fully toward me, closing off the rest of the room. We were a closed circuit now. I prefer to focus on the structure right in front of me. The subtext was gone. The text was screaming. She was queer, she was interested, and she was absolutely terrifying. I felt a flush rise up my neck, a mix of relief and a sharp, sudden desire that made my hands tremble. The gallery, the bad art, the noise, it all fell away. There was only the heat of her gaze and the absolute certainty that I was in trouble. Wonderful, dangerous trouble. The pronoun landed between us like a key turning in a lock. She, with that single syllable, the invisible barrier that separates polite strangers from potential lovers, dissolved. The air around us, already thick with unspoken tension, suddenly felt too crowded. We were standing in the middle of the main hall, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet the only thing I could focus on was the pulse visible in her neck and the way her eyes had dilated. The noise of the gallery, the clinking glasses, the drone of networking, the performative laughter became unbearable. It was static interference on a line that demanded absolute clarity. I didn't want to shout over a curator's speech, to hear her voice. I didn't want to share this electricity with the room. I wanted to hoard it. "It's too loud in here," I said, leaning in closer than was strictly necessary. My voice was low, a frequency meant only for her. "I know Spot, a smaller installation in the back wing. It's usually empty because there's no champagne bar nearby." It was a proposition, not a statement. I watched her weigh it. Leaving the safety of the crowd meant escalating the encounter. It meant following a stranger into the dark. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a beat of silence that a musician would understand perfectly. And then she nodded. The corner of her mouth quirked up again. "Lead the way," she said. I turned and the dynamic shifted, physically. I was no longer just observing her. I was guiding her. The crowd was dense, a wall of black velvet blazers and cocktail dresses that we had to navigate. I moved first, carving a path through the crush of bodies. The physical maneuvering required a new kind of intimacy. To keep us together, I had to reach back. My hand hovered near the small of her back, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of her through the fabric of her suit. Every time the crowd surged, we were pressed together, a shoulder brushing against an arm, a hip checking a hip. These weren't accidents. They were brief, electric confirmations of presence. The scent of her, that storm and sandalwood mix, trailed behind her, pulling me forward like a tether. We slipped through a narrow archway and into the side gallery. The transition was jarring in the best possible way. The bright, clinical lights of the main hall were gone, replaced by a soft, amber gloom. The air here was cooler, stiller. The installation was a series of suspended glass panels that refracted low light onto the floor in shifting geometric patterns. It was beautiful, precise, and mercifully silent. The roar of the party faded into a distant, muffled hum. We stopped in the center of the room, surrounded by the slow dance of light and shadow. The silence here wasn't empty, it was heavy. It pressed against us, stripping away the need for social performance. We were alone. I turned to face her. In the dim light, the sharp angles of her face softened, but her eyes remained just as intense. She was watching me, waiting for the next move. The pretense of the painting in the other room felt ridiculous now. We both knew why we were here. I lied, I said softly, breaking the silence. I didn't come over to talk about the abstract piece. I don't even like abstract expressionism. It's messy. Celine laughed, a genuine warm sound that bounced off the glass panels. I know, she said. She took a step closer, invading my personal space with a confidence that made my breath hitch. You came over because you were staring, and because I was staring back. I came over because you were the only thing in the room with any structural integrity, I corrected, my voice dropping to a murmur. Everything else out there is facade. You looked solid. Solid, she repeated, testing the word. That's a high compliment coming from an architect. It is, I assured her. When I see something that holds its own weight without buckling, I notice. And I spend my life making things that disappear, she countered. Music exists only in the moment you play it. Once the note stops, it's gone. But it requires the same precision, I said. We're both obsessed with tension. We just use different materials. Tension, she murmured, stepping even closer. We were now standing toe-to-toe, the distance between us negligible. Is that what we're calling this? I think that's exactly what this is, I replied. The air between us was so charged it felt physical, like the static before a lightning strike. We were two professionals recognizing the mastery in each other, not of art or buildings, but of this specific, terrifying pull. The way she looked at me wasn't just desire. It was recognition. She saw the blueprints of my intent, and instead of walking away, she was leaning into the structure. Tension, I repeated, letting the word roll around the quiet space of the installation room. It felt heavy on my tongue. But Ilara wasn't talking about physics, and neither was I. I looked at her, really looked at her, in the amber gloom of the gallery wing. The sharp, architectural armor she wore, the tailored suit, the severe hair, the confident stance, was still there. But in this light, I could see the fatigue behind it. It was a specific kind of exhaustion that I recognized in the mirror every morning. It was the exhaustion of being the person who holds everything together. You think I'm solid, I said quietly, my voice barely vibrating the air between us. You see the posture and the performance. But the cello is hollow, Ilara. That's the only reason it makes a sound. It has to be empty to resonate. It was a dangerous admission. I don't tell people that. I let them believe the myth of the virtuoso, that the music pours out of some endless, divine spring. I don't tell them about the hours spent in windowless practice rooms, staring at a wall, playing the same 4 bars until my fingers bleed and my mind goes numb. I don't tell them that the applause feels like it's for someone else, a ghost who walks out on stage while I hide behind the instrument. Ilara didn't look away. She didn't offer a platitude. She took a half step closer, invading the few inches of personal space I had left. The scent of rain and ozone was stronger now, intoxicating. I know about hollow spaces, she said. Her voice was stripped of the gallery performance, raw and low. I spend years designing homes for people I will never know. I obsess over the light in a breakfast nook where a family I'll never meet will eat toast. I build the stage for their lives, and then I hand over the keys and walk away. I stand in empty rooms that are perfect and silent, and then I go home to an apartment that is quiet. The word hung there. Quiet. It wasn't peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a life built on precision and ambition, where there was no one to mess up the throw pillows or play the wrong note. We are good at being alone, I observed. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. We have to be, she countered. To be this good at what we do, it requires a terrifying amount of selfishness. You have to choose the work over the dinner party. You have to choose the deadline over the date. Eventually, people stop inviting you, and you tell yourself it's fine because the work is good. The structure is sound. But it's cold, I whispered. Freezing, she agreed. The vulnerability was sudden and absolute. We had stripped away the professional masks, the architect, and the cellist, and were just two women standing in the dark, admitting that the accolades didn't keep us warm. It was terrified and thrilling. I felt a crack in my own chest, a fissure in the wall I'd built so carefully around my life. We were standing just outside the boundaries of polite society. My hand twitched at my side. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to place my palm against the sharp line of her lapel, to feel the heartbeat I knew was hammering beneath that expensive wool. The magnetic pull was undeniable now. It wasn't just mental, it was physical. Gravity. I felt my center of gravity shifting toward her, drawn by the density of her presence. She was looking at my mouth. The gaze was unflinching, predatory in the softest way. She wasn't hiding the want anymore. The air between us thickened, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was the moment before the bow touches the string, the inhale before the first note. I don't want to be cold tonight, Alara murmured. Her hand lifted, hovering inches from my waist, caught in the tension field between us. She was asking a question without speaking. She was offering to break the silence. I leaned in. The world narrowed down to the gold flecks in her eyes and the curve of her lip. I was ready to ruin the composition. I was ready to let the structure collapse if it meant feeling something real. Then, a crash echoed from the main hall. It was the shatter of glass, a tray dropped, followed by a roar of performative sympathy and drunken laughter. The noise was violent, jarring, and immediate. It shattered the delicate, intimate atmosphere we had built in the installation room. The spell broke. The world rushed back in. The noise, the gallery, the people, the pretense. We both flinched, stepping back as if we'd been burned. The distance returned, sudden and cold. The sound of the crash didn't just break the silence. It shattered the structural integrity of the moment. We sprang apart, the physical recoil instinctive and immediate. The magnetic pull that had drawn us to within inches of each other reversed polarity, pushing us back into our separate, safe corners. I smoothed the front of my jacket, a reflex to cover the sudden, gaping vulnerability in my chest. Celine turned slightly away, her hand coming up to touch her neck, her posture shifting instantly from the open, raw woman I had just been speaking with back to the guarded cellist. The mask was back on. I hated it. Before we could recover, the intrusion became personified. Alara, there you are. I've been circling this labyrinth for 20 minutes looking for you. The voice was booming, confident, and utterly oblivious to the frequency of the room. It was Marcus, a developer I had worked with on a high-rise project in Midtown. He stepped into our dim sanctuary, bringing with him the harsh, frantic energy of the main hall. He was a man who took up space not because he had gravity, but because he simply didn't notice anyone else existed. He held a half-empty tumbler of scotch and wore a grin that was all teeth and calculation. Marcus, I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, clipped, professional, cold. I was just hiding, he finished for me, laughing at his own joke. He stepped fully into the installation, his shiny dress shoes clicking loudly on the floor, drowning out the memory of our quiet conversation. "You're always hiding. Look, you need to come out. The board director for the Hudson Yards expansion is by the bar. I told him you were the only one with the vision to fix their atrium problem. He wants to meet you." "Now!" He gestured toward the door, an expectant look on his face. It was the golden ticket, a direct line to a legacy project. In any other universe, I would have been calculating the quickest route to the bar. But tonight, the offer felt like an insult. I looked at Marcus, and then I looked at Celine. She had stepped back into the shadows of the glass panels, effectively erasing herself from the conversation. She was watching me, waiting to see what I would do. She expected me to go. I didn't want the atrium. I didn't want the networking. I wanted the storm. "Marcus," I said, planting my feet. I didn't move toward the door. He stopped, his smile faltering slightly. "Come on, Alara, he's leaving in 10 minutes. "Then he'll have to leave without meeting me," I said. My voice was steady, precise. It was the voice I used when I told a contractor that their materials were substandard and I wouldn't sign off on the permit. "I'm in the middle of a conversation." Marcus blinked, confused. He finally looked at Selene, really seeing her for the first time. He looked from her back to me, trying to calculate the value of the interaction he was interrupting. He couldn't find the ROI. "You're networking?" "I am occupied," I corrected, sharpening the edge of my tone. "I'm not coming back out there, Marcus. Not tonight." The rejection was absolute. It was a breach of protocol, a professional snub that I would probably have to pay for later over an apologetic lunch, but I didn't care. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, processing the glitch in the system. Then, with a shrug that dismissed my sanity, he turned. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't try to make you famous." He walked out, the heavy sound of his footsteps fading as he rejoined the chaos of the party. The silence rushed back into the room, but it was different now. It wasn't the tentative silence of strangers. It was the heavy, charged silence of a decision made. I turned back to Celine. She hadn't moved, but the tension in her frame had changed. The guard was down. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and something softer, something that looked dangerously like hope. "You should have gone," she said quietly. "Hudson Yards. That's a big commission." "It's a glass box," I said, dismissing the skyline of New York with a wave of my hand. I took a step toward her, closing the distance Marcus had created. "I'm tired of glass boxes, I told you. I'm interested in structure, in things that hold up under pressure." "And you think this holds up?" she asked, her gaze dropping to my lips. "I think," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, "that I just turned down a $10 million lead to finish a sentence with you. So, yes, I think the foundation is solid." She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since Marcus walked in. The relief between us was palpable, a physical release of tension that left us standing closer than before. The interruption hadn't broken the spell. It had tempered it. It had forced a choice, and the choice had been made. Then, the overhead lights flickered. Once. Twice. The universal signal. "They're closing," Celine said, the reality of the clock intruding on us. "The gallery is kicking us out." "Good," I said, reaching out to grab my coat from where I'd draped it over a bench. I was done with the art, anyway. The overhead lights flickered again, a harsh, staccato rhythm that signaled the end of the movement. It was the gallery's way of bringing down the curtain, stripping away the amber warmth of our hiding spot and replacing it with the clinical, fluorescent reality of closing time. The spell didn't break, exactly, but it shifted. The private world we'd constructed in the installation room was suddenly invaded by the logistical necessity of leaving. We moved toward the exit, joining the stream of patrons flowing out of the main hall. The transition felt jarring. I'd spent the last 20 minutes tuned exclusively to Alara's frequency, her voice, her breathing, the specific cadence of her silence, and now the cacophony of the crowd rushed back in. It was a chaotic swell of voices, the clatter of heels on polished concrete, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. To my ears, it was dissonance, sheer noise without resolution. But as we walked side by side, our shoulders brushing with a familiarity that shouldn't have existed after only an hour, the noise felt distant. I was insulated. The connection between us acted like a mute on the rest of the world, dampening the harsh frequencies until they were just background static. The queue for the coat check was a purgatory of small talk. We stood in the line, surrounded by the same people we had spent the evening avoiding. I watched a woman in front of us complain about the white wine, while her husband checked his phone. It was a tableau of disconnected lives, a reminder of the hollow spaces Alara had described. I looked at Alara. She was staring straight ahead, her profile sharp and composed, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She was enduring the wait, tolerating the proximity of the crowd only because I was standing next to her. When we reached the counter, the interaction shifted into something strangely domestic. It's a small, intimate ritual, retrieving a coat, putting it on. But in that moment, it felt heavy with implication. I handed the attendant my ticket, and Alara handed over hers. Her fingers grazed mine as the tickets exchanged hands. It was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a shockwave through me that drowned out the chatter around us. The attendant returned with our coats. Mine, a long trench. Hers, a structured black wool coat that looked as architectural as she did. She took her coat, but didn't put it on immediately. Instead, she turned to me. She held my coat open, a silent offer to help. I hesitated for a beat. I am used to doing things myself, used to the solitary efficiency of the musician on the road, but then I turned my back to her and slipped my arms into the sleeves. I felt her hands settle on my shoulders for a fraction of a second too long. Through the layers of fabric, I could feel the heat of her palms, a grounding weight that centered me. She smoothed the collar, a gesture so casual and yet so possessive that my breath hitched. It was a rehearsal for a life we hadn't lived yet. It was the kind of thing you do for a partner of 10 years, not a stranger you met 40 minutes ago. I turned around to face her as she shrugged into her own coat, flipping the collar up against the anticipated chill. The movement was fluid, precise, and devastatingly attractive. "Ready?" she asked. Her voice was low, pitched under the noise of the crowd. "Get me out of here," I replied. We pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the Chelsea night. The change in atmosphere was immediate and violent. The gallery air had been recycled, warm, and thick with perfume. The air outside was sharp, cold, and smelled of wet asphalt and impending rain. It was a shock to the system, a sudden intake of reality that should have cleared my head. Instead, it made everything sharper. The city was loud, sirens wailing down 10th Avenue, the rumble of taxis over potholes, the distant hum of the West Side Highway. Usually, this sonic chaos grates on me after a performance. I crave silence to recalibrate, but tonight the noise felt rhythmic. It was a backdrop, a chaotic score accompanying the woman walking beside me. We didn't hail a cab. We didn't check our phones for an Uber. We just started walking. It was a mutual, unspoken decision to delay the finale. We walked north, away from the gallery crowd, moving toward the darker, quieter streets of the warehouse district. The pavement was slick with mist, reflecting the streetlights in long, distorted streaks of orange and white. "The air is better out here," Alara said, her hands deep in her pockets. She matched her stride to mine, a synchronized tempo that felt natural. "Real air usually is," I said. "Less filtered." "I hate the end of these events," she admitted, looking up at the silhouette of a water tower against the cloudy sky. "The transition is always the hardest part. You have to remember who you actually are." "Who are you tonight?" I asked. She stopped, walking under the pool of light from a street lamp. She turned to me, and the city noise seemed to drop away entirely. "I don't know," she said. "I think I stopped performing the moment I saw you." The words hung in the damp mist between us, heavier than the humid air of the gallery we had just escaped. I stopped performing. It was an admission that stripped away the last layer of defense. We were standing on the corner of 24th Street, bathed in the sickly orange glow of a sodium streetlight. The city was screaming around us, a delivery truck rattling over a metal plate, the distant, mournful wail of a siren, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. But in the 2 feet of charged space between us, the silence was absolute. I looked at her, really looked at her. The sharp, severe lines of her face were softened by the shadows, her eyes dark and reflecting the chaotic lights of the avenue. The wind whipped a stray strand of dark hair across her cheek, and my hand twitched in my pocket. The urge to reach out was a physical ache, a structural stress testing the limits of my composure. I wanted to brush that hair back. I wanted to trace the unflinching line of her jaw. I wanted to close the gap and kiss her right there, under the flickering street lamp while the city ignored us. It would be so easy. The script for this moment is written in every bad romance movie and every desperate networking after party. The intense eye contact, the escape, the street corner, the kiss. It is the expected climax, the cheap resolution to the tension we'd been building for an hour. But I am an architect. I know that if you rush the foundation, the structure does not last. A kiss now would be a reaction to the adrenaline, to the alcohol. I wanted the load-bearing wall. I wanted to know what she looked like in the harsh, unforgiving light of day, without the armor of the tailored suit and the gallery's flattering amber gloom. I wanted to know if the silence between us held up when there wasn't a party to escape from. I took a step closer, invading her space just enough to let her know I wasn't backing away. I saw her breath hitch, a small cloud of white vanishing in the cold air. She was waiting for it, too. Her chin tilted up slightly, a subtle, dangerous invitation. I don't want to end this here, I said. My voice was low, pitched to cut through the rumble of a passing taxi. But I don't want to rush it either. That gallery, it was all surface, veneer. If I kiss you now, it feels like part of the show, like we're just finishing the scene. Selene blinked, surprised. The expectation on her face faltered, then resolved into something more complex. A slow smile spread across her face, not the guarded smirk from the painting, but something genuine, warm, and devastating. So, what is the alternative? We shake hands and exchange business cards like good little professionals. No, I said, shaking my head. I want to show you something real. There is a site I'm working on in Brooklyn. It's raw, exposed brick, steel beams, no drywall hiding the cracks yet. It's honest. It's messy. Meet me there tomorrow, 10 a.m. 10 a.m.? She raised an eyebrow, amused. You are asking a musician to wake up before noon on a Sunday to look at a construction site? I'm asking you to see the foundation, I corrected, holding her gaze. I'll bring coffee. It will probably be terrible bodega coffee, but the view is real. It was a risk. A morning date is intimate in a way that drinks in the dark never are. Morning is for truth. Morning is for people who plan to stay. Selene studied me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. She wouldn't find any. Okay, she said softly. Send me the address. But if the coffee is cold, I'm leaving. Deal, I said. This was the moment. The departure. I pulled my hand from my pocket, no longer fighting the urge. I reached out and let my fingers brush against her cheek, tucking that stray hair behind her ear. Her skin was cool from the wind, but she leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a heartbeat. It was a promise, a deposit on the future. Go, I whispered, my thumb lingering on her jaw, before I changed my mind about waiting. She opened her eyes, dark and dilated. Good night, Alara. She turned and walked away, hailing a cab with that same precise, fluid movement she used for everything. I watched her get in, watched the taillights fade into the red river of traffic flowing south. I stood there for a long time, cold and alone on the corner, feeling the ghost of her warmth on my fingertips. The taxi disappeared into the grid, but the sensation of her presence remained heavy and distinct, like the afterimage of a bright light. I pulled out my phone, her number already saved under Selene, cello, and stared at it. The evening had begun with a stare across a crowded room and ended with a promise of bricks and bad coffee. If you've ever met someone who saw right through your performance, tell me in the comments. Subscribe for more stories.